Okay, everybody, thank you very much for coming out on a cold, wet Canberra evening. I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people of the Wiradjuri Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the Australian Academy of Science is built. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Well, good evening and welcome to the third of our Canberra Speakers series for 2018. This year it is The Science of Us. My name is Simon Foote and I am one of the conveners for this series along with Professor Lois Salmonson. I'm thrilled to be here in the iconic Shine Dome to join you tonight, and I thank you also being here and for your support of Australian science. As you are aware, this series will take us on a journey through our lives from conception right through to death. We're somewhere in the middle, I believe. We've done the conception bit and we still have the death bit ahead of us, a little bit like most of us in this room. We hope that you will continue to join us throughout the series as we hear from leading scientists in the areas of mental health, addiction, ageing and more. Tonight's talk is being recorded and will be online in the coming days on the Academy's YouTube channel. We invite you to join the conversation on Twitter tonight by using the hashtag #ScienceOfUs. We are very fortunate tonight because I'd like to acknowledge the attendance today by a total of 40 PhD students from Argentina, Brazil, Colombia and the US who are visiting for about 8 weeks to undertake research projects at Australian universities and research organisations under a program managed by the Academy with financial support from the Department of Education and Training. And these students, I believe, are up the back here somewhere. Put your hands up, students. Well done. I hope you're enjoying Australia and the wonderful science that we do here. With that, I'd like to introduce tonight's first speaker, an Academy Fellow, Professor Maree Teesson. Maree is currently the Director, NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in Mental Health and Substance Use, which is called CREMS for some strange reason. Anyway, probably something to do with Centre for Research. Anyway, she's an NHMRC Principal Research Fellow at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre and Professorial Fellow at the Black Dog Institute, University of New South Wales in Sydney. She's a Fellow of the Academies of Health and Medical Science and Social Sciences, and her research interests revolve around examining substance abuse in the context of mental health. Maree, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Very cheeky introduction. So here we go. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak tonight, and very much excited to speak about a topic where I'm doing research and the research is actually fun. And I'm hoping to be able to show you some of that fun in the science and the research. The topic tonight was when we are addicted, and what I want to talk about in the first 20 minutes is before we are addicted. So it's research that I have been working on around what can we do to prevent the harms from drugs and alcohol. Now, the talk, I'll just quickly give you an overview of why is prevention important. Because I do research on it? No, there's other reasons. The science of prevention, some prevention programs that we have been developing in my research team, and accessing how do you get access to things that work in terms of prevention. So some work we've been doing in terms of dissemination and translation, because there's no point doing fantastic science if it sits on my shelf gathering dust. So my American colleagues say to me, Maree, Australia is God's gift to alcohol researchers. This is not something that we want to be known for. In the last year, young people in Australia aged 14 to 19, 44% had consumed alcohol, 18% binge drinking monthly, 12% had used cannabis, and 3% had used ecstasy. Now, there is some very awesome good news on the horizon. More young people are choosing not to drink. So more teenagers aged 12 to 17 have abstained in 2016 compared to 2013. Go young people in Australia. And younger people are starting to drink later. So on average, 14 to 24-year-olds are trying their first glass of alcohol. In 2001, it was about 14.7 years, and in 2016, it was about 16 years of age. But remember, the legal age for purchase of alcohol in this country is 18. So it's still 2 years younger than when we are legally able to purchase alcohol. And while we have some fantastic good news on the horizon, we also have some indicators of problems. So rates of binge drinking remain significant. There's rates of very high binge drinking and very high risk binge drinking, and these are amongst our young people, the highest rates amongst our young people. And when I say high risk binge drinking, I'm talking about drinking 11 drinks in one go. So it's not a little bit, it's a lot. We've got 4% of 12 to 17-year-olds and 15% of 18 to 24-year-olds doing that. And of course, with that comes higher rates of victimisation and alcohol-related crime. In terms of illicit drug use, they're actually fairly stable over the past, from 2017 to 2013, and less than 20%, but still that's quite a lot of young people, 14 to 19 years, being exposed to illicit drug use. Okay. So we're going in a good direction, but I really actually think, shout out here, we can do better. So each year we delay the onset of drinking, we reduce the odds of developing an alcohol use disorder by 9%. And this is where I'm coming from. Can we do better, and can we delay the onset of drinking so that we reduce the odds of having problems later in life? And of course, adolescence is a crucial time for brain development. Adolescence is a period of profound brain maturation, and it's not complete until the age of 24. Anyone with teenage children or teenage grandchildren? You're all like, it took science this long to work this out? So alcohol and drugs can interfere with that brain development. So that for us is also a critical reason why we're trying to do prevention. So if we're going to do prevention, what are some of the risk factors for teenage drug and alcohol use that we might like to target? And so our science is telling us peer use and confidence to assert your own choices. The perception of use is normative, that if you ask 12 and 13-year-olds how many of their friends have had a full serve of alcohol, they'll tell you 60 to 70%, where the rates are much lower than that. Mental health and behavioural problems and personality factors that can leave you at risk for drug and alcohol use, and parental attitudes, monitoring and rule setting. Or often can be the case, the lack of rule setting. So, given those risk factors, what can we do? Now, prevention in the past has been incredibly boring. It's been just say no is the solution. And that does not cut it with your average teenager. They can tell the hypocrisy of that a mile off. So we really need to do prevention work that's engaging and working with young people. And that's the approach that we've been taking. Now, the first approach I want to talk to you about is what's called universal prevention. So that's delivering it to everyone, regardless of their level of risk. So, for example, delivering some prevention messages and prevention based on science of psychology to a whole school year. And the program we've developed, because I like to develop acronyms, even if they don't make sense, like CREMS, Climate Schools, changing the climate of a school. So this is a program that was developed by myself, Laura Vogel, who's a PhD student, Nikki Newton, who's Associate Professor now, Katrina Champion, who's in Chicago doing research. And it's based on 4 modules in Australian high school students, one on alcohol and cannabis, and one on psychostimulants and cannabis, and one on ecstasy and new emerging drugs. And it fits within the school curriculum. And this is like Neighbours for drug and alcohol prevention. It's a love story between the characters within this module, and it gets delivered in school. But within that module are the concepts around psychology and the concepts around normative use, challenging those perceptions. So it's the story between Michael, Claire, and Jane. Claire's a geeky brunette. It's not autobiographical, totally. And Jane and Michael, and their friendships. So we did extensive development over now close to 10 years with focus groups, interviews with teachers, and we've developed modules that fit within the school curriculum, 6 lessons. They're cartoons. Now, Marvel and Disney had it right. Young kids love to engage with cartoons and love to engage with the storyboard. And I knew we had the cartoons engaging and right when the classes wanted to get access to the final 6th lesson because they wanted to know what happened. Which girl got with which boy? So all the materials are all available online, and here's a funny bit about how science can meet art. Luckily, one of my PhD students was also one of the best friends. One of her best friends was a cartoonist from Disney. He'd just finished doing Happy Feet, and he was really keen to do something in the space of schools and cartoons, and he helped draw the cartoons with us. So just to give you an idea about what's in the cartoons, there's Claire. Here's a lesson. And as I'm going through, if the males in the audience would like to try and think, what is a negative consequence of drinking alcohol when you're 13 and 14 or 15 and 16? It's really hard. Girls, it's a lot easier to think of negative consequences. Unprotected sex, vulnerability. There's a whole lot of negative consequences. For boys, it's a lot harder within our culture. So here's Michael. He's having a good time at a party, a bit older, drinking, gets into a car, not a good idea. Hey, Claire, jump in. Come on, Claire's like, seriously, Mike, alcohol slows your brain down, so we get the messages happening about what's happening with the alcohol. Claire's going, you're a complete idiot. Fine, your loss, he takes off with the older, attractive female. The day after, knock, knock. There's hundreds of these cartoons, by the way. These are just a snapshot of them. I just want to say I'm really sorry about last night. Why do you always have to do stupid things? I suppose I get carried away when I have a few drinks. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. That was until I threw up in that older girl's lap. See all the men in the audience are going, yeah, that's exactly what you don't want to do when you're 14, 16, 18. So we've worked out that a negative consequence of male drinking is throwing up in older females' lap. And vomiting appears a lot in the cartoons. Good one, Michael. So we've built lesson summaries for teachers with teachers. That's all great. It looks pretty, but does it work? So being a researcher and bringing the science to it, we've now run randomized control trials to test whether it actually does work in terms of a prevention sense. So we've run 6 trials with 157 schools and just over 14,000 students across a large number of states in Australia and 1 trial in London. And we've got published papers looking at the effectiveness. We know we can get an increase in knowledge across the drugs. We know we can get a decrease in alcohol and cannabis and ecstasy use. The decrease in terms of binge drinking, we get a reduction in rates of binge drinking from about 21% down to about 12% at 16 years of age. We get, there it is, that's the clicker. I should have clicked before I said that statistic. That's after 3 years. We get reduced harm from alcohol, and we get reduced intentions related to alcohol and new and emerging drugs. So we've been really excited about these results, but it doesn't get to everyone. It really is across the whole school, and it makes a difference across the whole school, but it doesn't get to the kids who are at risk. So even though it was well received by teachers and students, we wanted to ask, could we not just approach prevention from a whole of school perspective, but could we also approach prevention from a selective? Could we pick out the kids or the young people who for a number of reasons may be more vulnerable to develop problems later in life? And then can we give them some inoculation? Can we give some intervention to help them? So we've worked with Patricia Conrad, who's at the University of Montreal, develop a brief personality target prevention program. So this is increasing the coping skills and to prevent substance use and associated harms in high-risk adolescents. So these aren't the kids that are drinking, that's 13 and 14, but they're high risk in terms of having personality profiles that are linked to misuse and psychopathology or mental health problems. So what are they? Now, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up to describe yourselves, but these are the 4 main personality types that we've been working on. So negative thinking is someone always feeling, oh, it's baby. That's really starting prevention early, I've got to say. The mother in me is like, oh, yes. I feel that I'm a failure. Anxiety, sensitivity, I get scared when I'm too nervous. Sensation seeking, these are the adolescents who want to jump out of a plane. I like doing things that frighten me a little. The impulsive, I usually act without stopping to think. And people can sort of see themselves a little bit, and sometimes in more than one of these categories. But what we found is that these personality factors, not substance use, not experimenting with drugs and alcohol, but the personality factors can identify adolescents who are potentially at higher risk of running into problems once they start having drugs, start drinking, or if they experiment with drugs. So our first step was to identify these characteristics, and then the second one is just to give a very brief intervention. So 2 90-minute coping skills workshops delivered in a school, facilitated by, in our case, clinical psychologists, and the interventions are based on motivational interviewing, setting goals, pros and cons, and cognitive behaviour therapy. So understanding the link between your thoughts, the physical sensations, and your actions. And so we've done this with the trial with 2,500 kids, and we identified the high-risk kids, and we'd bring the kids who were most alike for either impulsive or sensation-seeking or negative thinking or anxiety together in a room, and we run these 2 90-minute sessions. And it was amazing, because they would sit there and go, this is the first time anyone is actually talking to me about how hard I find it to interact with the world, or how do I think differently. So it has been phenomenal with the response from the young people in the trials. So it's great, again, to develop something, but is it effective? Well, it's been shown to be effective in the UK and Canada, but we all know Australian kids are slightly different from kids in the UK and Canada. So we needed to test and adapt whether it will work here in Australia. So we've trialled that recently among Year 8 students, just over 2,000 young people in the trial. And we did find that, it did reduce alcohol and binge drinking, it reduced alcohol-related harms, and it reduced emotional and behavioural problems. So we've been really, really excited about the potential of those programs. But even though we're getting those great results, currently they pretty much sit on the shelf in my office, in my academic space at the University of New South Wales. So I really wanted to just briefly talk about how can we get this information out there. And this has been a phenomenal collaboration between the researchers, between policymakers, and more recently between philanthropy. So we've developed a portal that everyone here can get access to, so that you can actually get access to all of these resources if you're interested in them. They're focused around providing resources for teachers, students and parents. For school staff, we've got programs that integrate in with the curriculum. And for parents, we've got evidence-based prevention practices and fact sheets and resources and webinars and training. For students, we even have a game called Pure Rush that you can download from Google Apps. and engaging young people into knowing the facts, knowing the myths, and using some of these evidence-based programs. How are we going in terms of reach? Well, at the moment we've got about 126,000 people regularly using the site, both nationally and internationally. So I think it's a really fantastic example about Australia leading the way. And more recently, we've just done a national competition and engagement around a portal which is built for young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, which has been a great collaboration. Okay, so summing up, earlier initiation of drug and alcohol is associated with long-term harms, and we've been passionate about trying to understand whether prevention can both occur early but also be effective. And more recently, our science has shifted to not only trying to understand the effectiveness of our interventions, but taking that and asking ourselves, can we shift that focus to translation and work more broadly? And that's what's fantastic and exciting about being able to talk to an audience as broad and as diverse as I've got in front of me today, that it is fantastic to be able to take the research and engage with community. And that's what we've been doing with the translation. And if you want to find out more, that's where all of the websites are, or you can just Google me. The Health for Life initiative is a recent funded initiative by the Paul Ramsay Foundation. And just acknowledge all of the funders, as a good academic would. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Maree. We'll have questions after Murat. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's second speaker, Professor Murat Yucel. Murat is a trained clinical neuropsychologist and NHMRC Principal Research Fellow. He is currently appointed as a professorial fellow within the School of Psychological Sciences at Monash University, where he is leader of the addiction program within the Monash Institute of Cognitive and Clinical Neurosciences. MIC-N. I don't know where these people come up with these acronyms. We will have to start, agitating for decent acronyms. And co-director of the Brain Mental Health Research Hub. Please join me in welcoming Murat.
Thanks, Simon. It's quite an exciting time for me in my research because we're just about 2 months away from finishing this concept that we're calling Brain Park, which is up on the top left of the screen. And it's really an idea where we think it's a world first, next generation kind of, it's a lab, it's a high grade scientific lab that meets a clinical intervention facility, it's a technology facility, and it's also a bit of art and design facility, all in the one space. And essentially what we're trying to do is change the way that people with addictions experience their addiction, how we think about their diagnosis and how we treat them. So it's another way to think about things. And I'd like to take you through a bit of a tour of what that might look like. But first I have to give you a little bit of background. So I actually think that we're pretty much all designed to be vulnerable to addiction. It's just the way that the brain is, it's the way it's wired. If you've read the book by Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, he talks very much about the two systems, one of them being very automated. The brain is designed to automate things. If we didn't, life would be unbearable, we'd become overwhelmed, we'd be very inefficient, and we probably wouldn't survive. So it's a very necessary part of living that we have habits. And habits are things that are very powerful, and you only realise how powerful they are when you want to give them up. Acquiring habits can be quite easy, but giving them up is where it's really challenging, and we've all been there. And I think as we develop these habits and acquire them, they start to form parts of our character, they make our decisions, determine our lifestyle choices and so on. And one of the most remarkable things we've learned is that the brain is actually, it's not this glorious machine, it's actually a dynamic living thing. So anytime we have a repetitive experience, a high intensity experience, or repetitive and high intensity, our experiences are changing the brain. So the more we engage in behaviours and certain things, the more we're wiring the brain towards that. So if you just think of your own day, you probably had many habits. 8 a.m, time, a trigger for coffee. You might have a visual trigger at 11 a.m, you saw a candy bar or a sugary drink. That's a trigger for another habitual. You might not commit the behaviour, but you'll be triggered. Stress might be another trigger, a more emotional kind of reaction to a habit, whether that's coffee or smoking or alcohol. So there's all these triggers that we have, but the other thing we know from psychology, from 50, 100 years of research, is reinforcement is really powerful to determine how we make habits. So if this lady who is stressed here, she might decide, okay, bugger it, I'm going to go to this very colourful pokey casino area where I might win some money and I'll behaviourally distract myself from the negativity and deal with my anxiety that way. She might decide to take it to a chemical form and be reinforced by how she's alleviated her negative anxiety with alcohol. Or she might go for the more emotional, sort of the uncertain form, all these pushed Snapchats and emails that are sitting there. Who knows what possibilities are in those that distract her from the anxiety, and they might all reinforce her habit. Now, unfortunately, this is an unsubstantiated number. I'm putting the numbers together and guessing that I think there's about 25% of the population that have harmful habits. Why do I say that? That's a staggering number. If we think of the people that have problems with tobacco, alcohol, gambling, internet, they are all validated numbers. Many people have combinations of them, but loosely guessing, I'm thinking there's probably a quarter of the population. And that doesn't include things like food, sex, shopping, porn, all those other addictions as well. And it may not get any better because the industry giants, they understand how triggers work, they understand how reinforcement works. And so one industry giant, alcohol, will tell us, put their brand on a big bus. It's just a trigger. Do I feel like beer? They'll associate it with success and sport. They'll associate it with having a good time or just relaxing. And just these little triggers, little cues, little reinforcements. And that's just one industry. There are many industries, gambling, food, etc. It's coming at us all the time. And up to 80% of those people who have a harmful problem, a habit, won't get the help that they need. Could be stigma, could be they don't have access to help, and so on. And Maree's obviously doing a great job, but there's still a lot of people who just won't engage. And if you look at the 2016 survey of over 20,000 youth, they actually identified drug and alcohol as the #1 issue that concerned youth, them. And mental health is down at the third one there. So together, if you think of things like gambling and internet and food and the mental health issues and the drug and alcohol, 50% of youth think that this area is a real major issue for them. So Maree talked a bit about tapping into some of these personality characteristics like sensation-seeking, impulsivity. Now, we know they're factors that relate to vulnerability or how people make choices and decisions. If a young person was to come to us and say, okay, well, how do I measure my mental health or my mental fitness or my brain fitness so I know whether I'm resilient to good or bad effects, we wouldn't be able to give them very much. We wouldn't be able to tell them very much, but we know that mental fitness and brain fitness is critical for a foundation of all our behaviours, all our decisions, and our lives. But if I replace that and said, how would I improve my physical fitness? Many of us around the room would probably have a pretty good idea. Oh, of course, you'd have to do some endurance, some speed, power, body composition, agility. It depends what you want the outcome to be. And then you'd think about a baseline, an end goal, you'd come up with a training package. You'd be able to do it. But we can't really do that with mental or brain health, and it's a major challenge. The frustrating thing is, and I've been in this space doing it for 20 years, brain research and understanding how the brain works. We understand how the brain works pretty well now by peeking into it over 20 years. We've got a pretty good understanding of how the pleasure system works, how the value system, how we set goals. And these three systems here are quite, we understand them, but we don't quite know what to do with them yet. We do understand that these systems tap into our habits. They generate them, they maintain them. We understand that these systems are the ones that engage when industry tries to advertise to us and reinforce certain behaviours. We understand that when addiction takes many faces, that these systems are relevant and important. So we understand all this, and we understand the science. We also understand the brain can change, so it gives us hope. We understand the role that technology can play to take these things out, like Maree is doing over the internet, to people. And we understand more and more the value of lifestyle, like exercise, mindfulness, how that can have a role in changing, but we can't quite put it all together. And that's the frustration for me of not being able to do that, but yet being in this space for 20 years. So about 4 years ago, I moved to Monash University from Melbourne University. I made that a point of change where I could try to actually do something about it. So I'm lucky at Monash, they have a big campaign now, if you don't like it, change it. And that really fits well with where I'm at in my career. So I would like to change it and just tell you about what we're trying to do to try and change that. It's got three components. One is getting the right people in the room, having the flagship platform to work with, and then having the right partners and being able to implement what you're doing. So now, the people, addiction is a complex problem. It's not simple. And the brain is complex, and lifestyle is complex, and habits are complex. So in our lab, we have people who span anywhere from brain science to computation, technology, business management, behaviour change, and so on. But we have 5 areas that we concentrate on. Understanding the science, creating assessment tools from that, interventions, clinical and society. So we want to get it all the way out into society and clinics. Now, when we first started this kind of vision of trying to make change, we had a number of key words that we came up with where we thought, this is what we want to do. We need to be doing research and interventions in this space. And these are the kind of key words that came out. So we wanted to, there's just not enough clinical services available to treat all of those addictions that you can, and that's just some of them. We have to come up with a way that people can be empowered to help themselves. So things have to be cost-effective, accessible, safe. We can put all fancy technologies in a space, but if people can't afford them and use them and access them, it's no good. And if people feel stigmatised, it's no good. And if they're not inspired by that technology or what you're doing in the intervention, it's no good. So we need things that are scalable, inspiring, and time resilient. For too long, we've ignored the physical part of mental addiction problems and how that can also affect the cycle of addiction and bad habits. So we need to do things in a much more integrated way. That's at the risk often of science, because science likes to be pure. Was the outcome due to physical exercise or was it due to mindfulness? But what if you did a trial where you combined them? Science wouldn't like that too much, but it might be a better outcome. It's a challenge. And finally, because we are scientists, we want to measure lots of things. We want to measure the brain, cognition, mental illness, mental wellness, productivity, and what you want, what the person wants themselves. So we want to do all of this. The research lab or the facility didn't exist. So we were very fortunate to have a philanthropic organisation come on board with a long-term vision and help us create this. The David Winston Turner Endowment Fund really helped us create a platform so that the people can work in this integrated way where we were able to combine all of these approaches in a one-stop shop. So this will be completed in two months' time, and we'll be able to ask questions like, how does lifestyle and technology facilitate the cycle in and out of addiction? We'll understand the mechanisms of that. How can these be used to improve their condition and reduce their risk of increased resilience? How do we measure and monitor people's mental health and brain fitness? Not just a feeling, I feel well, but how do you actually measure it and how do you feed that back? What does mental health and brain fitness look like at these neuropsychological and neurobiological levels? And how can we create a better system outside of the clinic, but into the community as well, of getting this information out there? So let's just take a quick virtual tour to give you a bit more of a feeling of what it might look like. And I'm going to take a tour through a more of a technology path, but equally I could take you a physical or a lifestyle path like physical exercise. But this one is just more about the technology. So first of all, when you come to Brain Park, the idea is the experience will be different. So it won't be disempowering, it'll be interventions that you can take with you when you leave, and there'll be things like exercise or yoga or mindfulness. They'll be inspiring, very engaging, game-like. You're working together with the researcher or the clinician to either exercise or train your mind in a certain way. In this case, there's interactive spin room, there's virtual reality rooms, and also we're still doing hard science, but it's in the background. It's not in, we're not wearing white coats and doing science. It's a very collegial and in the background element. So we're wrapping around the person lifestyle interventions, neuroscience, technology, art and design. As I said, we understand the brain quite well, and what these two senior staff in the group are doing is they're working with a game designer who's quite a leading person in company in this field, and they're designing an online app that has been approved by experts around the world as saying, if you want to understand the individual differences of addiction, these are the areas you need to focus on. So we're actually creating games that people can play relatively quickly that tap into these systems that also use artificial intelligence. That will be freely available if people choose to take an interest. So this is happening, and the nice thing about it is it's gone through both. We've spoken to people who might use it with addiction to say, would you actually do this? Would you play this? Why would you? Why wouldn't you? A number of world experts have endorsed it. It's brain-based and it's personalised. And the personalised bit's important because we're not focusing on alcohol, gambling, internet, food, all these behavioural symptoms. We think a lot of the drivers of those come from here. So if we can understand this by having these accessible games, it's a good start to understand who might be at risk and so on. So the person's come in having a good experience, they've done an assessment, and they have a gambling problem that they're trying to deal with. And we know from a clinical sense that there's all these really interesting clinical phenomena that occur with a gambling addiction. So we know that we need to split the gambling up in three elements, that it's the person playing, the environment, and the agent, the actual electronic gaming machine. They're all highly relevant to why someone is addicted or stays addicted and so on. Typically in a lab, you would take the person and sit them in front of a pretty simple, what looks like an electronic gaming machine, because we like to have control. We need to control all the elements so that we can understand what's happening. And so it wouldn't tell us the full picture because we're not understanding how the elements of the agent or the environment are working. So welcome to the virtual casino. This is an actual screenshot from a virtual casino that we've built that you can walk around in. Now all of a sudden it feels real and you can make decisions, you're in control. And we know that there are different stages of gambling, from habit, just early phases, to problem, to addiction. And the machine is designed very, very cleverly to tap into elements of your design, the things that you're built to do. Things like how you deal with uncertainty, how you deal with learning and reward, and these cognitive biases that we tend to have. So we can now take a person through and study the links between what the machine does, break them down, and how the person is responding, to understand that in a much more intricate way than would have been possible, because we can't just send someone in a casino and measure all this stuff. So now we're working in an environment that's ecological, it's real, it's engaging, we're measuring lots of things while they're engaging in that environment, and it's safe. We're putting people in a high-risk situation, but in a low-risk space. What about intervention? What would we do there? We know that for gambling, exposure therapy is actually quite effective, and this shows one by some Australian colleagues who have done exposure therapy, and it's quite effective. But it involves sitting in a clinical room, imagining a lot of things. Imagine you went to the casino when you did this, or when you go to the casino, remember to do that. So what if we could put the headset on and take them to the casino while they're in the clinic or while they're in the research lab? And then we could measure things again in a much deeper, richer way. And now we're talking real-time intervention, potentially, or a much more empowering way, because the person can be in control of what they're doing, engaging with the clinician as they're doing it. We could also combine this with mindfulness. So as you're feeling urges of gambling, you could surf the urges by doing mindfulness while in VR. Or we could use something like brain stimulation to downregulate craving or upregulate self-control circuits. And there's evidence that both of them work for gambling. What if we combined it and made it stronger, faster, better? Last couple of slides. If we can do all of this, and this is one example, then the next challenge is to take it out into the clinics and the communities, and where in the moment we're developing some very deep relationships with substance use services, behavioural addiction services, OCD, and recently community services, where we want to take all this out as quickly as possible. And we have a group of Brain Park champions who are making sure that what we do is meaningful, people who have lived experience, and relevant. And Rebecca's pushing that forward. Finally, the other thing, again, this is a virtual reality screen capture. These signs here, we can play with them. We can put pro-gambling or harm minimisation messages and see if it actually made any difference to the person's behaviour. There's a lot of money that goes into putting these adverts up or putting them out, but very little evidence. We can also put pop-ups in machines, so telling you how much you've lost over the last few minutes or so on, or what are your kids doing, you know, these different kinds of messages, and see if they actually work and can be a policy, a societal kind of policy issue. So I think I think there's a real delicate dance that happens between habits, lifestyles and brains, and if we can really understand them, we can empower people to beat addictions. And I'll just leave you with two quotes that I think are pretty powerful. Thank you.
Murat, thanks very much for that. Now we've got time for some questions from all of you guys, and we'll get both of our speakers up, and we have two roving microphones. So if anybody would like to ask a question, just put your hand up in the air and one of our microphonists will be there. There's one over here. Okay.
Hello. I'm wondering about the difference between people who can break a habit cold turkey and others who have to go through rehabilitation. Is anything being done about that, research in that area?
There's a microphone.
We're not looking specifically at that issue, so I can't say anything directly to that.
Yeah. It's going to be a mixture of, like, I think what Murat and I both said in the talks is it's so complex what leads someone to addiction, from the personal to the to the societal, many factors are involved in it. And we try and hone in on what aspect we might be able to implement to actually help the person who goes from drinking alcohol to then having a problem with alcohol. But again, it's this complex system about individuals. And that's actually what is the most interesting thing about the science of addiction for me. It's trying to understand that. How can one person drink alcohol and never have a problem, and their brother or sister or family member run into problems? So the things that we try and do, all those personality factors that I was talking about, they're the things that we find leave a 14 or 15-year-old more vulnerable once they start drinking to actually having a problem later on. So that's just one example. Yeah. It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but I think there's a real interesting transition that happens between knowing something, we all know smoking's bad or something, but then to actually make that wisdom, that commitment to giving up. And sometimes that's a big emotional event that happens in someone's life, and other times it's just took them a certain amount of time to convert knowledge into this kind of action, this wisdom action-based thing, and it's different for different people.
Okay.
Good question. That's what gets us up in the morning.
It's very good. It's very good to hear you talking about your evidence-based investigations on this. This is Canberra, and we've got all these politicians around, and sometimes you wonder about whether the things that are pushed in the political world are evidence-based or driven by other factors. So I'm just wondering if you could comment about how your evidence-based investigations gets accepted or dealt with in a political context.
Policies.
Yeah, wow, that's an awesome question as well. And it's a dialogue, and it's a continuing dialogue. I actually think your statement, you've couched it as a question, but it was actually a true statement. Is it? Not always. Not always is it evidence-based, but we're trying to work more and more to having a dialogue and a policy connection where things can be evidence-based. In this area, in the addiction area, it is such a hot topic because people have it can be terrifying. So we try and work towards having dialogue and communication and policy engagement. And the Positive Choices portal that I put up, that's government funding. And that was launched by the Prime Minister. That's really awesome investment in actually getting the evidence base out there.
Okay, next one.
Working. Oh, yes, it is. I noticed that you had some apps. I also noticed on TV the other night that the food people and the games people are ahead of you with their apps to addict children as young as 4, 3, with their apps to get them addicted. And that was in relation to obesity and food products and gaming products. How can you stop that kind of thing when the advertising for betting and things are on TV, children are being exposed to it much, much earlier, and parents are giving them the apps to keep them entertained, not thinking how addictive they're making their children?
Another great question. I mean, I think it is disturbing. Well, first of all, it's hard. The industry is almost always ahead of us. Just purely the funding is so dedicated to this understanding triggers and reinforcers and design, and there is so much funding that often they're ahead of us in many aspects. And it's disturbing because I have heard even stories of in the casino that there are these mini casinos where you have these colourful chips and you play pokie machines, young kids as entertainment to keep them busy while their parents are doing something else, and all that conditioning that can start at a very early age is disturbing. We think, recently I was actually in the courts giving evidence about the design features of electronic gaming machines, and I think there are some features there that need close attention, and good science does play a role in the courtroom and in changing policies, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think for the first time, having something like virtual reality where you can really break things down and take each individual element of the machine and understand how it works, what effect it has, and prove that scientifically can then have an effect. But it's a long, hard battle because it is David and Goliath.
Yeah, I think that was well answered. And I suppose it's just also knowing that technology can be for good, not just for bad. And we are up against Goliath, but we have, we've been able to create technology which is great and actually improves and has some great positive outcomes. So I don't want to chuck out technology. I want to make sure we do the good technology, but we are up against it in terms of the investment that's placed in actually increasing people's addictions.
There's one other space to look out for is the lines are blurring between gambling, which is heavily regulated, and gaming, which is unregulated. And so there's a lot of gambling move into gaming because it's unregulated and the same systems apply. So watch this space.
Okay, I'm going to one more. Don't be, like the thing for me though is even though we're up against David and, we're David up against Goliath, I showed you that 13 and 14-year-olds can change the trajectory of their lives with really very minimal interventions and minimal support. So while it sometimes can feel like this is impossible, we actually have to work with the power of the young people and work with them to change the trajectories, because they're the ones getting exposed to all of this, but they also have control and agency. So how do we empower that? So don't go away thinking it's all doom and gloom, because otherwise you and I wouldn't get up in the morning to go to work.
Any further questions? Yes, one down here. Is this an optimistic question? I hope.
Yeah, come on.
I can try and make it an optimistic
No,
one.
you're right.
Thank you for your talks, both of you. But my question is really more for Maree, because you were talking about how there are differences in the responses of kids in, I think it was Canada and the UK. Are there differences in the rates of addictions and also binge drinking in particular with Australia compared to other cultures? And is there any sort of evidence to show that perhaps we should be trying to change our cultural approaches towards alcohol and drugs, as well as just trying to enforce interventions on younger people and making it their responsibility?
Oh gosh. Yes, yes, and yes. There are quite large cultural differences. I think it's a mixture of both. It is changing the culture. So we heard a lot about the exposure in the answer to that last question. And we know that young Australians get exposed to something like 56 million instances of alcohol advertising just by watching the National Rugby League. So a huge amount of exposure. Now, should we be changing the culture? Yes, we can be doing that at the same time, but I also think we want to address things at an individual level too. And I'm a bit of like, do what you can do. And so the work that we were doing and we've been doing in schools is a little bit of, let's see what's possible and what we can do there. Are there differences across cultures? There are. We do have very high rates of binge drinking. When you run us up against the league tables of other countries across the world. But the main thing I was referring to was it was really hard to get the Australian kids to tell us what the goals were in life. Every American kid wants to be. Have we got American students up here? Yeah. What do you want to be? You want to be the president? Yes. You got a goal? No, you don't want to be the president. Whereas, and in the UK, it was easy to get kids to tell us what their goals were. In Australia, it was really hard. It was hard to get, just generally, in doing those interventions. So that's what I meant by there were quite big cultural differences.
And there's a question from the balcony at the top here.
Yep. It's great to hear you talk so much about students. I'm a high school teacher, today talking about addiction with my students.
Oh, salt of the earth you are. Yay.
What myths on addiction would you like dispelled?
Oh, myths. Yeah. The normalisation is a big one. that we just have, and that's some of what we've been asked in these questions here today. If you expose so much to alcohol, then at 12 or 13 you're thinking that's what life is and the only way to have fun is to drink. So it's really challenging. That normalisation for me has been a really big part of what we've been doing.
Okay.
And thank you for all the awesome work you do. School teachers, salt of the earth, thank you.
And another question from the balcony.
Hi, I'm actually from Colombia, so my question is focused on developing countries. How, you mentioned, and in the map, I think Colombia appeared as one of the countries that is accessing your information, but there is a big difference between the universal and the selective approaches, in which the selective approach needs psychologists to be able to talk to the kids. And how cost effective would that be? Because Australia is betting towards abolishing and getting rid of addiction. Colombia isn't quite there yet. So how would you focus this on developing countries?
Well, and I wish Australia was heading that direction, but so thank you for saying so, but maybe we're not quite there yet. The selective, it's actually been trialled in, not Colombia, but it has actually been trialled in now 17 different languages and countries. So there's quite a lot going on. And probably enough now for us to be saying that those factors, maybe we can do them cross-culturally. But if you want to do some research with us and doing in your country, that would be fantastic. I'd love that.
Thank you.
Okay, and we've got time for just one last question over here.
Oh, g'day. Not a very clever question, but I reckon you'd probably be better off going back to referring the substances as alcohol and other drugs, rather than drugs and alcohol, as it was 10 years ago. Just to so we can appreciate the drug, that alcohol is a drug as well. The other thing was that there's something missing in this whole thing, and that's the family. You did mention just then about normalisation, so the child goes to the family, and everything that they've been told about the addiction is just the life they see when they go back. So I just thought it'd be a nice idea to take 10 kids into the bush for a week and dig up witch-dig grubs or something. So without actually lecturing them and judging them, and maybe that'll click, as well as the other methods. So anyway, that's just another slant.
Want to say something? I mean, families are really important, and we've actually just designed a program within schools to try and engage parents in this, and actually been really difficult to engage the parents, but we're starting to slowly work out ways, often online, of engaging parents in this space. And I don't know yet whether it's going to make our findings better or not, but I've got a hunch it might, and so it'll be really fun to be able to talk to you about that in maybe 5 years' time, but I don't know yet.
Okay, well that brings us to the end of our time. For our two speakers, thank you very much for coming interstate to get here and giving us such an interesting view on addiction. I think I've learned an enormous amount, and I'm sure many of you have as well. So thanks so much. So, and I am looking forward to the next episode in our inexorable journey towards death. So I will see you next time. Have a pleasant evening.